The Chris Johnston Show.
Let's go!
Your number one destination for a behind-the-scenes look at the game of hockey.
Is this thing on?
Here's NHL insider Chris Johnston and host Julian McKenzie.
Siege, we are fastly approaching the NHL trade deadline. I'm sure your phone is buzzing. Your head is in a million different places. We're just getting out of the Four Nations break. How you feeling before we delve into the topics? You doing all right, man? You doing good? You ready for this?
Well, I'll give you some stats. 11 hours, 49 minutes. 10 hours, 9 minutes. 8 hours, 41 minutes. Those are the last 3 nights how much I've slept. So I'm jealous. I don't mean to rub it in because I realize a lot of people that's not even a possibility to have those kind of 3 nights of sleep, let alone 3 in a row. But yeah, you know, when I'll say this, when you see some weird results in the next week, and obviously we saw a couple over the weekend as the games got going, I'm going to point you to the fact that I didn't play a game in the Four Nations. I didn't celebrate after the final game like, you know, I would expect some of the players did, and they earned that right to. And I still was basically in a living coma all weekend. So I can only imagine how, you know, we've seen the players, honestly, most of the guys that played in the final game Thursday for Canada and the US have not bathed themselves in individual glory since playing NHL games again. And I think there's a good reason why. So I'm doing really well after that weekend because now I feel rested, rejuvenated, and excited for this sprint to the trade deadline. But yeah, that tournament took it out of me, and I imagine it did the players. That's why I do think someone said to me, Julian, and this is that someone predicted that Washington would be a real team to watch because they didn't send anyone to the tournament. Mm-hmm. And obviously it started pretty well for them, 8 goals and 7 goals in consecutive days on the weekend. But you know, just something to tuck under your cap that some teams that had more players at the Four Nations break. I mean, obviously we'll talk about some injuries and whatnot coming out of the tournament, but even those players that returned healthy, it might be a bit of a crash here, just, you know, emotionally after going through that tournament and now getting back into a crazy NHL schedule.
Absolutely. We're definitely going to tap in on injuries. We're definitely going to tap in on someone who scored a handful of those goals for the Washington Capitals over the weekend. But I want to start with some of the trade talk that is starting out there, particularly around Seth Jones in Chicago. We know about the contract. We know about the AAV. It seems like there seems to be word that he would probably want to play for a winner. We know The Athletic, they've reported on it. Just reading off a line here from a story written from last week, league sources confirming to The Athletic that Chicago and Jones were exploring trade possibilities, but it was also described as unlikely anytime soon. Is that still the case as we get up closer to the deadline? Has anything changed? What are you hearing on Seth Jones right now?
Well, I think we have to wait and see a little bit in this circumstance because there's some unique aspects to this. I mean, the fact that Seth has come out and spoken to reporters on a couple occasions now so openly about it is unique. And, you know, I think part of that obviously is being done just because he's an honest guy and he doesn't mind it being out there, but also it's about seeing, you know, other teams. Maybe, you know, as this becomes sort of common knowledge as opposed to something whispered in the background. And Seth Jones has already been on the Athletics trade board. So It's not entirely a surprise, but I think it goes to a new level when you've got someone speaking about it. And, you know, it shouldn't surprise anyone to hear he wants to play somewhere he feels he has a chance to win. I mean, the main reason for, I don't know if we'll call it a trade request, but a trade desire from Jones is that he hasn't been on teams that have been in the playoffs. And he sees the years flying by here, and he sees a Chicago team that, quite frankly, still looks 2 years away from being 2 years away. You know, I don't see a path to them certainly being cup contenders in the near future, but even getting back to the playoffs looks like it's going to be a bit of a journey yet for that Blackhawks roster. And so, you know, that's how we've arrived at this moment where he wants out. And so, you know, the problem is, yeah, he's got the full no move clause. Obviously, he's got a lot of say in it. Let's face it, a $9.5 million cap hit with 5 seasons left. That's a no move clause. I mean, that's in itself, that's an immovable object, even in a world where we're anticipating the cap to jump. You know, I think the good news here is Chicago is willing to consider or look at retaining salary. You'll recall, probably the closest comparable to this, and it's not even a fair comparable, might be the Karlsson trade from San Jose to Pittsburgh in 2023. In that case, so Erik Karlsson was coming off a Norris Trophy, and it was his third Norris Trophy. Now, Seth Jones is a very good player. There's a reason he got the contract he got. He shoots right. He skates well. He can log big minutes, all situations type of defender, but, he's not at that level. And I only bring up the Karlsson contract because at the time, he's an $11 million guy, 11 and a half. They get with the retention, San Jose, entertained in that deal. They got his contract down to $10 million a year. Chicago's probably going to have to do something similar in order to move Jones. And so, I think it's too soon. I think based on the contract, it's easy to say it's not likely to happen, but this is a motivated player to try to find, I think the team and the player are working together. Something important to underline here. This isn't an adversarial position. I think they're trying to find something that works for both sides. And maybe now that this is public, something will shake out here in the next 10 or 11 days that sees them move on. And if not then I'm sure we'll be picking up this conversation at some point in the off season.
Is there a destination that makes the most sense for Seth Jones to end up?
Well, from his end of things, I think it's natural to want to play places like Dallas or Florida. Teams that absolutely, tick the box, basically every box, but the competitive box, nice place to live box, the tax box, the everything. Obviously he's got ties to Dallas, the son of Popeye Jones, spent some of his youth there. So I think that when you hear those teams speculated or suggested, it's not coming out of nowhere. That would be probably a player wish list type of thing. The real issue too is it's not even if let's move aside that he's overpaid. Let's just call it as it is. What team that is good can accommodate that? I just don't think there's that many in season that can even think about that. Now, there might be an exception here. Maybe something will come up. Maybe Chicago will be willing to do something to make, all that line up in the short term. But I don't think it's at a point where he's saying it's only these three teams or these five teams. I think that there is sort of a spirit of collaboration. There's an understanding that if he truly wants to move on, he's probably got to consider maybe not just his first options, but maybe get into second and third options, other places that might make sense. The connection with Florida, in addition to the fact that they've been to 2 Cup finals in a row, one last year, is Bill Zito is the GM of the Panthers. So, worked with Seth when both were with the Columbus Blue Jackets. So there's some familiarity there, some trust. I could see, and look, Florida's got a decision pending. Aaron Ekblad is a UFA. I think that there's a world that this guy gets moved. I don't think it's impossible. Whether or not it can happen by March 7th to me is the question. That's a short time frame, and we're talking about a big trade. But it's kind of interesting. You don't often see a player in the NHL anyways doing the kind of interviews Seth's done. It's almost like a small campaign has begun to see if there's anyone else out there that might be looking to do something. And, this has been an interesting trade year. We've seen some things happen I wouldn't have expected to happen. The JT Miller circumstance, obviously Mikko Rantanen moving kind of out of nowhere. We've just seen a lot of different types of moves. With the cap growing, I think it's possible we see some what I'll call different behavior or different types of moves happen before this deadline. And, obviously if they were able to move Jones in season, that would qualify as one of those.
Speaking of Rantanen, what are you hearing about him? Is he more likely to stay? We've seen reports of him getting a 9-figure offer for an extension, or is he likely to go? Of course, with the trade deadline coming up. What are you hearing?
I think this goes down to the wire. Obviously Carolina didn't trade for him to flip him. That wasn't the goal. And this is such a weird circumstance. He's been a member of the Hurricanes officially for a month now, but he's played 7 games because we had the Four Nations break. And, some of those have been road games. So he hasn't even really spent much time in Raleigh during that period. Obviously Carolina traded for him to try to sign him, and they're attempting to do that now. And I guess there's this sort of exit box on the side where if he says to them, look, there's no chance I'm signing with you, then they have a decision to make. And maybe that's where a trade scenario comes in. As of this moment, that hasn't happened. And in fact, while other teams are trying to keep the wires hot here, that might be calling the Hurricanes and saying, hey, if you guys do look to move him, we'd like to get in on that. I don't have any reason to believe that Carolina's entertaining it at that level. I think the Hurricanes are fully focused on trying to win a Stanley Cup this year, trying to keep Rantanen around long term. And I'm somewhat sympathetic here to all sides, because if you're Mikko Rantanen, like, it's a big decision to make. You've just been traded kind of out of nowhere from your perspective. You might like a lot of things in that first month about being a Hurricane, but are you ready to make that kind of commitment? Are you ready to pass up the possibility of free agency? Those are big calls. I mean, this is going to be obviously the last big contract of his career, most likely. I would expect if he stays in Carolina, he's signing an 8-year deal. And if he hits the open market, he's probably signing a 7-year deal. I mean, he's basically signing away the rest of his NHL career. And so I think you got to be sure. And so, in that vein, I think it would be, this is one of those ones. It's because it's such a big name that I think there's a danger in assuming too much or that it gets portrayed that the Hurricanes are trying to move him. I don't think that's actually the case. Nothing has changed from their end of things. It's just there's a little bit of a deadline here looming, and the deadline is a trade deadline. And that doesn't mean they need to have him signed by then, but I think there has to be a certain amount of conversation between Rantanen, his agent, and the team about, what that might look like. And if it's going to be a no, it would obviously benefit the Hurricanes to know that by March 7th, because then they could act accordingly. I mean, talk about a trade chip if they did elect to move him. I mean, because of the salary already retained in the initial deal, when he was passed through Chicago, they can get his contract down to under $3 million a year in terms of his cap hit for the rest of the season. And so, that you're not just potentially trading Mikko Rantanen, a guy who's a 100-point player and very, very productive player in the playoffs. You're trading Mikko Rantanen at a cap number that basically any contender could afford to fit under the ceiling right now. And so, there's a lot of moving dynamics there, and I'm in no position to predict or try to telemark which way this is going, because, it just really depends what Mikko Rantanen decides for his own future. I think that will dictate it. And look, he might get to March 5th, let's say, just for fun. He gets to just before the deadline, and he and his agent, or him personally, says, look, I'm just not ready to commit to you guys yet, but it's not because I know I don't want to be here. I just need more time. I mean, then Carolina's in an interesting spot. And remember, part of what's got to color this from the Hurricanes end is they made a pretty big deal for Jake Gensel at last year's deadline, certainly put a massive foot forward to try to keep him in free agency. He ended up going to Tampa and testing the open market. But, there might be a little bit of, that's got to be in the back of the mind of Eric Tulsky and management there, is just, giving up those kind of assets and potentially seeing another player walk away. I mean, look, the Hurricanes knew there was risk in the initial deal. Right from, back in January when that trade was made, they knew there was risk there. I think they deemed the risk worth it because of the kind of player they've got. Mm-hmm. And I know the numbers don't yet sparkle for Rantanen in terms of points and goals since he's in Carolina, but if you look under the hood, I mean, the numbers that a team, especially like the Hurricanes, look at, I mean, Rantanen has been very good for them. And he's a few bounces or maybe a little more puck luck, or maybe even just getting a little more settled on bearing down on some chances away from, putting up the sort of numbers that he was in Colorado. If you just look at chances, I mean, everything suggests he's been had a pretty dominant start there. So what a weird set of circumstances. Just because we don't see trades like the initial one in the NHL now, there's maybe I don't even know what percentage chance to put on Julian, but I think it's probably a small percentage chance that Carolina moves on from him, just because I don't know that Rantanen's going to be able to say one way or another within less than 2 weeks. I'm definitely want to go or something like that. And if he's open to staying, it's going to be like, why would you trade him? I mean, they've already given up Martin Necas, Drury, obviously the draft capital. I mean, the Hurricanes, there's a reason they went out and got him. It wasn't to play him for 10 games and then to flip him. And so, we'll just have to keep monitoring this situation and how it develops, because right now I could see it going a couple different directions.
I'll say this though, like if Carolina gets itself in a position where they're able to flip Mikko Rantanen for whatever reason, I'm on the side that says they don't end up moving him. I got to imagine that return has to be bang on the draft picks because of the fact that you can get him at such an affordable rate for salary if you're able to retain more on him. Like, just, I don't know. Like, it would be really wild to see him move again. I don't see it happening, but like, I'm here for the craziness of the storyline. I always root for chaos with these stories.
Well, I mean, it's not the same thing because it's certainly not the same caliber player, but last year, the Vancouver Canucks traded for Elias Lindholm earlier ahead of the deadline. And then you'll probably recall, because I was in the center of the next report, he was then part of some subsequent discussions about maybe being flipped to Boston. I know it didn't end up happening. Everybody denied it vehemently in public, but, shocker, all shocker, he re-signs in Boston as a free agent once that season ends. And so I guess my point is there is some precedent. Where there's no precedent is we just haven't seen a player as good as Rantanen in the prime of his career traded in a long, long time as it is. And, it's just such an interesting, how does he view this if you're him? I say this with nothing against the Hurricanes or Raleigh, or it's just, wouldn't you be tempted if you've already had your life turned upside down to at least look at free agency? Now, the one thing the Hurricanes have, and we shouldn't look past it as an advantage, they're the only team that can offer 8 years. Like, if you're talking about a 9-figure offer on an 8-year contract, you can get to 9 figures with a $12.5 million a year offer. If you're doing it on, a 7-year deal, which is what any team would have to do in free agency, they'd have to be over 14 million to get to 100 million plus. And so I think the Hurricanes can obviously give him more money over more time, which tends to be appealing. And look, there's a lot of reasons for him to like Carolina too. Great place to live. His buddy Sebastian Aho's there. I will say this. I was out for dinner one night in Montreal during the Four Nations event, and 5 or 6 Finnish players were at the same restaurant as me, and 2 of them were Sebastian Aho and Mikko Rantanen. So they had lots of time to spend together as teammates with Finland during the Four Nations tournament, in addition, obviously, now in Carolina. And so I think that the Hurricanes were banking on some of that helping them and just betting on their program. I mean, they're a team that have been right in the mix now for 5, 6, 7 years in a row. They've won playoff series, I believe, every year. Rod Brindamore has been the head coach. This is a team where you have a chance to win in a city where people like to live, and they're going to pay, they're obviously trying to pay Mikko Rantanen his market value. So you combine all that together, there's a lot of reasons for him to stay. It's just, his head must be spinning a little bit with the way this is all shaken out and gone down. And, I feel like the Hurricanes, I haven't looked at their schedule. I feel like they haven't been at home barely since the trade happened, because they were in the New York area when the deal went down. Obviously, then you got Four Nations, Rantanen's in Montreal and Boston, and then they're come out of the break on the road. I mean, it just feels like maybe you'd like to have more time to settle this out, but the deadline's March 7th, and some decisions have to be made, even if by then the decision is just for Carolina to hold on to him and keep trying to sign him beyond the deadline and into the offseason.
For what it's worth, Carolina tomorrow they are in Montreal to play against the Montreal Canadiens, and then they have.
So he's back in Montreal.
Yeah,
I won't dox him, but I wonder if he's going back to the same restaurant again.
That's how that. I mean, you know what? You go with what works, right? If your guys are liking the spot, why not? Yeah, and then you got
I like the spot. I went twice during my 7 or 8 days in Montreal, so that speaks to how much I enjoyed it.
I'll text you off camera to know what that spot is. I'll add that to my list of spots. For the next trade question I have, you can totally say, hey, you know what? I don't have a name right now. We can revisit it at another time. Is there a name you're hearing floating around that maybe you're surprised to know is as available as they are ahead of the deadline? You can always revisit it.
No, I mean, I don't know. When you characterize it that way, it's hard to say. I mean, look, Braden Shen's name is out there. I know Braden addressed some of those reports with the reporters in St. Louis, but, he's got some trade protection in terms of deciding where he goes. But, I think that other teams have identified him as someone that could help. And I think St. Louis is kind of in that mode where they're open to a lot. It's been a frustrating season for the Blues. We've already seen them fire a coach and go through the whole thing with Brandon Saad. And, it just feels as though there could be more shoes to drop in St. Louis. So I think that they're a team to watch ahead of the deadline. And, you wonder if Shen could go. I mean, one name that's always seems to be out there, but it's another St. Louis connection, is Colton Parayko's for whatever reason. He's been out at previous deadlines. Coming off, I think, was a really strong showing for Canada at the Four Nations. But I wonder, I've heard a little bit of scuttlebutt around him, so you wonder, could something happen there? I'm curious what goes on in Vancouver, too. I mean, a couple tough losses out of the break, starting with back-to-backs in Vegas and Utah. Quinn Hughes still hasn't returned to the lineup healthy. And, Brock Besser, it doesn't sound like there's anything close to traction there for an extension for him. Do they look at moving Besser? I mean, it's probably a tough – teams tend to – that are in the playoff run chase, the way Vancouver is, they tend to hold on to their own rentals, we call them, in this situation. But you just wonder with Besser, they've had a long time to sign him, and it hasn't happened. I think that there's a significantly different view of what the organization thinks he should be paid and what he thinks he should be paid. And so, he's a name to watch out for here as we get closer to March 7th. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot more. As I said, I'm of the view, this is such a weird deadline. I mean, we basically, February 1st was the day of the big deal between Dallas and San Jose, the Granlund CC deal. There's been a couple, what I'll call minor trades in the time since, but not really players that are NHL players in the moment. So we've gone basically 3 weeks without a trade because of the Four Nations. And now we're just days from the deadline, 11 days as we record this. And so I just think the whole thing is kind of weird. I wouldn't be surprised if we're surprised, is I guess what I'm trying to say, is that, it's been, everything about this season has been different with the way transactions work. There's so much hope that the CBA is going to get done in short order here. We know that the cap is going to take significant jumps the next 3 seasons. The league is more wide open to me than it's ever been at the top end. I mean, hard to identify a favorite. I mean, the 2 best teams right now are Washington, which doesn't ever seem to lose, and Winnipeg on the western side, has built up a little bit of a gap there. But, neither of those teams have had a recent long playoff run, right? So you just wonder, are these just regular season teams? Can they do it? I'm not here to poke holes in them. It just doesn't feel like the established powers are quite as established as there have been in the past. And so you combine all that together, I think we've got a pretty fun 10, 11 days here, hockey fans. And I gave you a couple names there, but I expect by Thursday's show, we'll have a little bit more to talk about too.
Yep. Looking forward to that. This episode of the Chris Johnston Show is brought to you by ZBiotics. I have to tell you about this game-changing product I use before a night out, and I know I'm going to have some drinks. It's called Pre-Alcohol. Specifically, the ZBiotics Pre-Alcohol Probiotic Drink. It's the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Pre-alcohol produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make pre-alcohol your first drink of the night. Drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. I go out on the road a lot. I have some opportunities where I get to hang out with a couple buddies in different cities, all the different colleagues I know. And when I'm able to have ZBiotics, it really helps me out for that very next day. So for this March Madness, don't let anything sideline your celebrations. Grab pre-alcohol before you can go out and get ready to cheer on your team all night and all day long. Go to zbiotics.com/CJS to learn more and get 15% off your first order when you use CJS at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with a 100% money back guarantee. So if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. A product only available in the United States. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/CJS and use the code CJS at checkout for 15% off. Speaking of established powers, I think of the Florida Panthers as an established power. A lot of people in Florida worrying about the health of one Matthew Tkachuk. Paul Maurice went on radio in Florida this morning and said that the injury that he has suffered during the Four Nations tournament, Matthew Tkachuk, is going to take him out for some time. But the big quote going around, He's playing for us this year. That's the big quote going around from Paul Maurice on Matthew Tkachuk. When you hear that, what say you about Matthew Tkachuk, and what else have you been hearing on that front?
Well, that's an encouraging update from Paul Maurice because, I can say as the players left the Four Nations event in Boston, heading into the weekend, there was concern in the air that, Tkachuk's season could be lost. Now, it sounds like that's not the case. He's dealing with a muscle type of injury. Obviously the Panthers are putting him through testing right now. And it's my understanding as on Monday, he's got another medical appointment that will probably determine or dictate exactly the severity of the issue he's dealing with. But it's obviously significant. I mean, rewind the tape. It was a week ago Saturday. It was the first Canada-US game at the Four Nations. Matthew Tkachuk couldn't play the last 12 minutes of that game. The U.S. then faced Sweden in a game on Monday night, and he didn't dress for that one as a precaution. And then the final on Thursday, played about 7 minutes, couldn't, basically was relegated to the end of that game as a cheerleader on the bench. I mean, it's even that sort of set of circumstances alone spell out that, how much this tournament meant to Tkachuk, and to the Tkachuk family, his brother Brady as well, his family all there. I mean, if he could have got on the ice against Canada in the final, he would have. And so, yeah, there's real concern about the length of this injury, and the severity of it. And, it sounds like the Panthers are working their way through it, but that is a development that Paul Maurice, gave those comments that he'll be back this season. That's great to hear. Because, the feeling was this is a pretty significant injury that Tkachuk is dealing with. And so we got to kind of see where that goes next. But this is the flip side of a tournament like this. If you're going to have, players playing at full max speed, max intensity, unfortunately, there's going to be some injuries. Charlie McAvoy's facing a long layoff. It sounds like in Boston, after, suffering a shoulder issue and then, the subsequent infection he developed. And, Tkachuk probably has the most significant injury, of the players that skated right into the final just because, he tried to play through it. I mean, the good thing too, I'd say, cause, this is the side that owners don't like all those years. Remember when it was a debate, did they go to the Olympics or not? And Gary Bettman would inevitably say, well, our owners don't really like shutting down our season to lend their most valuable assets to something like this. This is admittedly, if you're an owner of a team, if you lose Matthew Tkachuk for a meaningful amount of time, your chances of winning go down by some percentage. The good news I was going to say, though, is that Bill Zito, the Panthers GM, was working with USA Hockey's management group at that tournament. So, that would have been a case where, everyone would have been making decisions, understanding the repercussions, understanding, the Panthers had a seat at the table, I guess is what I'm going to say, because, it's pretty clear the Bruins haven't come out and said it out loud, but it's pretty clear that they have some concerns with the way McAvoy's injury situation was handled during that tournament. Two sternly worded statements on back-to-back days kind of confirm that, and I can confirm even further just from behind the scenes chatter that they weren't happy with the way everything went down there with him. And it's because there's this weird separation of sort of club and country when you're at a tournament like this. But at least in the Tkachuk case, Bill Zito was, he was in the inner circle with USA Hockey while they were working through that. And, it's unfortunate. I mean, I see some people second guessing why did Tkachuk dress? Why, I don't know exactly when he was hurt. It seems to me, and the impression I have is that it got worse the more he played on it. It's not like he went into the last game thinking he could only play 7 minutes. Pretty clearly, you're not scratching Kyle Connor, knowing you could only play Matthew Tkachuk 7 minutes healthy. We could have a debate about why they scratch Kyle Connor at all, although maybe that moment has passed for us. But the point being is, Tkachuk left it all out there, and he's definitely facing a layoff of some, I think, a fairly significant layoff for the Panthers, but we'll await some official reaction from the team after he sees the doctors on Monday.
Yeah, because I see this quote, but he's playing for us this year. And in my head, my next question is, does that mean he's back for the playoffs? Is there a world he's somehow back for the regular season? I don't expect that. When you mean this year, are you talking about 2025? He's going to be back some point in 2025? Like, I have questions about that because, like, he could be back this year. He's not lying, but like, that's just my follow up to that.
It seems like he's reacting to this notion that he might be done for the season, right?
Yes.
And there was legit talk of that swirling around as we packed up and left Boston. So like, that's not a made up idea, but I think that we have to understand in the moment when an injury happens for a player, there's like an initial sort of diagnosis or idea of what it might be. But obviously, depending on the nature of the injury, you've got to go for x-rays or MRIs or something to get a full understanding of what the damage is. And then in some cases, you go through different potential treatment plans, which have varying amounts of time before a player gets back. The point is it's not always black and white the moment an injury happens, how long exactly the player's out. And so where we're at right now is, Matthew Tkachuk didn't get down to Florida again till, to rejoin the Panthers until Friday. It's only Monday. Everyone understands this is a serious injury. This isn't just like a day-to-day, but I think exactly what the treatment plan is and how long it's going to keep him out is still a little bit up in the air. The fact he's getting back this year, though, I mean, look, that is the next question. I mean, if he's done for the remainder of the regular season, there's potential cap benefits there that the Panthers can take advantage of. Not saying they want those benefits. Obviously, they'd rather just Matthew Tkachuk come back fully healthy and ready to go and playing their games now. But it could create some interesting scenario where they can add some players or a player at the deadline that maybe they wouldn't have been able to. And so, the good news for Bill Zito and his front office is there's enough days to work through that and adjust whatever plans they had for the deadline accordingly.
For sure. You mentioned the Boston Bruins, Charlie McAvoy, and what's going on with his shoulder, and Hampus Lindholm's season looking like it's going to be over as well. Really tough time for the Boston Bruins to be facing some injuries, considering where they're at in the wild card race right now. As we're talking, on the outside looking in, 1 point behind the Ottawa Senators and the Columbus Blue Jackets, who are tied on points, but the Senators are in that playoff spot. What say you about the Boston Bruins? I remember earlier this year we talked about what life was like for them post firing of Jim Montgomery and how eras end, and what could be next for this Boston Bruins team as they try to keep their playoff hopes alive, but it's not looking good right now.
It isn't looking good. And Don Sweeney's already come out in the media on Sunday and said, essentially, we're not going to be aggressive at this deadline. I mean, this is a team that's been aggressive at every deadline. You can go way back to them trading for Rick Nash. In more recent years, they've traded for Dmitry Orlov, Tyler Bertuzzi. They actually acquired Hampus Lindholm a couple years at the deadline and extended him. I mean, this has been an organization that every year has been pushing whatever chips it could into the middle to try to win. And it doesn't mean they don't want to win now, of course, but I think that they're being realistic about where they stand. I mean, to me, it's not just the Bruins record and the fact, they're 1 point out of the playoffs. Like they're like minus 26 or something in goal differential. And look, there's no one perfect stat. And I'm not saying there might be some noise in a stat like that too, but it tells you something, generally speaking, if you've played almost 60 games and you're being outscored by your opponents to that degree. I mean, it's just a lot of things didn't go right in Boston this year. Almost feels like they got off on the wrong foot with the way everything played out with Jeremy Swayman. Didn't sign him right until the end of camp. Look, and it might just be the rent has come due, right? It might just be as simple as some of their key players are aging out. The depth isn't what it used to be. I mean, all of the above. Brad Marchand had 3 surgeries last summer and had a pretty slow start to the season. Now he has come on a little bit since then. But you add it all together, and I just think that they're looking at a retool in Boston. The other thing Sweeney said is that he's going to engage with Wade Arnott, Brad Marchand's agent, on trying to sign him before the deadline. But he said basically the other deadlines, the other pending UFAs are probably not going to be re-signed. And so, Trent Frederick jumps out to me from that list as a player who's likely to be moved. He's been on the trade board since day one this year, so it's not a full surprise, but I mean, it's a public acknowledgement that, basically they're probably going to part ways with him as opposed to re-signing him. And so it stands as a pretty interesting deadline for Boston because, while it may not be I'm not expecting a full scale fire sale here, but I mean, they could be trading guys out versus bringing players in. And that alone is a significant shift in direction from where they've been. It's not where management would have entered the year expecting to be. And, what'll be interesting for me is how do those Marchand talks go? I mean, if they can't come to an agreement on an extension before March 7th, is there a world where they look to move him? I mean, it's unclear yet at this point in time. I think all things being equal, he wants to be there. They'd like to keep him, but that doesn't mean that they're going to see eye to eye on the numbers or the term. And, perhaps that'll be a big decision that Don Sweeney has to look at it as well before the deadline hits.
I can't picture Brad Marchand any other jersey than the Boston Bruins. And if it gets to a point where the Bruins have to move on from him and they move him at the deadline, you're just going to add him in that category of like athletes wearing jerseys that just don't look right. Like it's just, that's just me talking here. Like Brad Marchand, as far as I'm concerned, like
it'd be like Joe Montana in a Kansas City Chiefs jersey for those of a certain age. Like he just can't believe it ever actually happened.
Or like Kevin Garnett in like a Brooklyn Nets uniform. And I get he played for 2 other teams before then, but still like what are we doing here? Like this is Hakeem Olajuwon in a Raptors jersey. Like what are we doing here? That's what I would think with Brad Marchand.
Did Hakeem even play for the Raptors? I don't think he did.
I mean, I don't know how long it lasted, but there is footage of him in a Raptors jersey. You can go on Google.
I thought he was the guy they traded for and that he never actually played a game.
Alonzo Mourning.
But I appreciate the sentiment. Oh, Alonzo Mourning, right. Good
Alonzo
call.
Mourning in the Vince Carter trade, you're thinking of him. But Hakeem Olajuwon, I don't know if it was a preseason game or I don't know if it was regular season games, but he definitely at some point was stepped on a hardwood floor for the Toronto Raptors. But all that to say, Brad Marchand, if he has to change address.
Who's the weirdest hockey example of that from recent memory?
Weirdest hockey example I could think of. I don't know why my brain is not. Just trying to think. Like, I mean, Erik Karlsson wouldn't count because I don't think that's that weird. Maybe Joe Thornton in like a Leafs jersey. No, Thomas Plekanec in a Leafs jersey was really weird, but that's not as big as you're thinking. I
mean, Patrick Kane might have been weird for some in a Rangers jersey, but maybe now that he's in year 2 in Detroit, it's less weird. I mean, the fact remains, it's what's unusual is a guy who spends his whole career in one place, right? Yeah. That's what's weird. What isn't weird is playing for multiple teams. But when you get to Brad Marchand's stage of life, 36, second round pick of the Bruins that was part of their 2011 team, was part of their teams that got to the final in 2013, 2019. It's now their captain. It just feels like he would be someone that would retire Bruin. But that being said, I still think he's got a little juice in him. I don't know if it's one more good year, maybe 2 more decent years in those legs. But I mean, you can't tell me if you couldn't find a spot for him in like the Vegas roster, or maybe, some people everyone wants to unite everyone from Halifax. So maybe he ends up in Colorado or something. Like it would be fascinating to see him, trying to win a cup somewhere else. But I don't know, look at that. The push is on to sign him. And usually if you're the captain of a team, you've spent your whole life in one city, it's hard to think about moving. I will say this about Brad Marchand. Having spent some time around him the last 2 weeks, he seemed in a very reflective mood. I'm sure part of that's just driven by the fact he doesn't know for sure if he's even going to be with Team Canada again at the Olympics next year. So he was probably trying to savor these games. He was getting to play those games at TD Garden, the last 2 anyway, in the Four Nations tournament. But he seemed like a guy who was in a reflective state. And it's probably just because, as simple as his future is a little bit murky, even to him, he doesn't know how this is going to play out. But part of me wouldn't mind seeing him somewhere else. It's not because I think like it'd be great to see him finish off in Boston, but I'm also thinking like, does he want to finish off in Boston where they maybe miss the playoffs this year, next year, and the year after? Like, it's kind of like the Crosby-Malkin discussion, right? And Crosby in particular. Mm-hmm. I mean, Pittsburgh's on its way to a 3rd straight year out of the playoffs. Like, do you want to see Crosby finish his career with 5 straight years out of the playoffs just to say that he retired a Penguin? Like, it doesn't seem right to me. But, it's obviously his call to make and not mine sitting here behind my microphone.
For sure. One other name that just came to mind, Daniel Alfredsson in a Detroit Red Wings jersey at the end of his career. That was very weird. Yeah, I'm just going to start thinking about all these different names.
Well, some of them you almost forgot it happened. That's partly why I asked the question. It's just, at the end, like even Iginla, and I know he bounced around, right? He was, Boston, Pittsburgh, LA, but like it was sort of weird always to see him play somewhere else, Colorado.
Yeah.
But he bounced lots of places. He's the danger of the guy who leaves the place trying to win a cup because he made all those moves and didn't get the cup in the end. It's a tough thing to do.
Yeah. Biggest thing missing on Jerome Iginla's mantle. One more thing, I guess, before we get to Ask CJ, we have to talk about Alexander Ovechkin again. 13 goals away from completing the great chase for Wayne Gretzky's goal-scoring record. Gets himself a hat trick on Sunday. What did you think of him starting out of the gate from this Four Nations break? And when do you think he's going to break that record?
I think he's going to do it in Winnipeg. Is that game March 25th? I think
March 20. You're big on that day. You are big on that day for him to do it. Why?
I mean, because we're all guessing blindly, and I'm guessing blindly at his only remaining visit to a Canadian market this year. It does start to feel more inevitable. I mean, it's the funny thing is 13 goals and the Caps have 25 remaining games. Like that's not a slam dunk even for a good scorer, right? Like someone like Ovechkin can go 5 or 6 games without a goal. And then all of a sudden you're like, ooh, he's down to 19 games and he needs, 13. But the way his season's gone and obviously the way his career's gone, I think everyone's starting to now brace for it to happen this season. I loved him sort of fist bumping his son through the glass on Sunday as he put those 3 in the net. Look, the Capitals have been one of the great stories of the season. And so it almost adds to what's going on with Ovechkin. I mean, he could have scored 5 or 6 goals, quite honestly, in that game against Edmonton. He had 9 shots on net, 12 attempts. I watched some of the game. He was all around it. And I think he's pretty motivated to get it done. I mean, I guess the question for me has always come down to this. When it comes in sight for him, does that sort of like push him to charge toward the finish, or does that almost add more pressure and make it less likely to happen quickly? I mean, who knows? We're all guessing. This is a guy though that entered the league as a number 1 pick who had tons of expectations, scored in his first 2 games, just hasn't stopped scoring since. So I guess the safe position on that call would be that he just sprints to the finish here, but we'll see. I mean, it's going to be weird when, we get a little closer and Wayne Gretzky's traveling, Gary Bettman's traveling around, the pressure is going to mount, but this guy just seems inevitable. I mean, if he's going to get 9 shots a game, which I realize he's not, but having an afternoon like he did Sunday certainly suggests that the record's going to fall at some point in March. And if I'm going to pull up my dartboard, I'm going to say March 25th in Winnipeg.
The NHL
I think I said April. Remember you did this earlier in the year, and I picked a game in April. I just can't remember which one I picked. So.
It was a Carolina Hurricanes game, if I recall correctly. It was one. I think like the Caps and Canes were supposed to play each other like April 2nd or something. I can double check that now, but I remember the
Coburg Papa reminded me of this. I should have stuck to my original pick because we could have dusted off that audio if he did it, and it could have been like CJ Nostradamus time or whatever.
Yep. April 2nd, I mean, we might have to get producer Donkey Face to help us out with looking back through the archives, but the Caps and the Hurricanes play against each other April 2nd. For what it's worth, the NHL on their PAR account says that Ovechkin is on track to break the record April 4th at home against Chicago. So, and also the Canes and Caps have another game in April.
Ooh.
Okay, Donkey Face.
Producer drops in. April 4th against Chicago is what I predicted, apparently.
Okay, so you did predict April 4th. Do you have the choice right now?
Yes.
Right now. Do you want to stick with your original prediction of April 4th, or do you want to go back and say, you know what? March 25th is my final answer.
I'm sticking with April 4th now that I've been reminded that I made that. I mean, why would I change?
That's fair. All right, that's perfect. I like that. So April 4th, officially CJ's prediction for when Alexander Ovechkin will break Wayne Gretzky's goal scoring.
Let's clip that audio if it gets close there.
Yes, we will absolutely have that. And you know what? I said that the Ovechkin thing was going to be the last thing before Ask CJ, but literally coming in now, the Department of Player Safety announcing that Trevor Zegras will have a hearing for interference against Detroit Red Wings player Michael Rasmussen. Pretty brutal hit on him from Sunday. I'm sure you got to see it. Your thoughts on Zegras getting this hearing?
It was not a hard call for player safety. I mean, textbook hits the player in the head, unsuspecting opponent. I don't know how many games he's going to get, but I don't think that, I can't imagine there was a terrible amount of debate about whether this was meriting a hearing, and it wasn't called on the ice either. So we'll see what they come up with, but we're still waiting as well on the Ryan Hartman appeal ruling from Gary Bettman, which I think should be any minute now. But I think with Zegras, this isn't one you and I are going to scream back and forth about, because it seemed. It was actually Jesse Blake that put it in the chat before I'd seen it anywhere else, video of it. And my first thought was, oh yeah, that's a hearing. That's a suspension. So you've got a player I don't think has much of a history, if any, in Zegras. So that'll probably lessen it somewhat. But, this one, unfortunately, clicks a couple boxes that make it a pretty easy suspension for player safety.
We'll get through questions on Ask CJ. If by some chance, as you mentioned, by any minute now with Ryan Hartman, if we get to that, we'll get to that. But let's go through these questions first. And if we hear about Ryan Hartman, we'll get to Ryan Hartman. How do you feel about this question from ATX Broccoli FC? I like this one. Can we get a stick tap to Mike Lang and his incredible career calling games? Elvis has truly left the building. Of course, the longtime Pittsburgh Penguins broadcaster passing away a couple of days ago. Just going through his catalog of calls, one of the most iconic voices in the National Hockey League, and he will be dearly, dearly missed.
Yeah, and a real part of the family and the fabric there in Pittsburgh. I think this highlights what a great broadcaster in your local market can mean. Because, that person, or sometimes it's people, but generally one person gets associated with, almost being the voice of the team, that tells you about all these things. You end up spending a lot of time together in a roundabout way. And I feel like that's what Mike Lang was for Penguins fans of a certain vintage. And he just did it for so long. I mean, his calls go back to the Lemieux Yager era as players, obviously up to and including Malkin, Letang, Crosby, Fleury days. And he only retired a couple years ago. And so, yeah, that was sad news to learn last week when he died on Thursday. But absolutely a stick tap, because, the Penguins won 5 Stanley Cups with him as their broadcaster. Had some tough days too, went through a bankruptcy and all these things, but he was the one constant throughout for Pittsburgh hockey fans, and had a really unique way of calling the game, and all those catchphrases, I guess, are what live on a lot in people's minds. But it was always cool to go down to Pittsburgh, as I did a lot during my career, and see Mike there, and, gone too soon. Absolutely.
You're right. The catchphrases are really iconic. Scratch my back with a hacksaw. Slap me silly Sydney was one. Sean McDonough actually called the Washington-Pittsburgh game of the weekend, and he said, scratch my back with a hacksaw. That was a good tribute to him. But just an iconic voice. Next question. Absolutely. From Leaf Optimist. This is a trade proposal. Matthew Nyes for Mason McTavish. Who says no?
I have no idea, honestly.
You're ruminating on this. I have to really look in. Bit.
Well, it's just because I'd have to look into. I just don't. Why would my first thought is why would either side do it? But. Like, the Leafs don't have a Matthew Nyes problem. Like, the Leafs are going to sign Matthew Nyes. And, my point is of all the, I don't see that being, I just think both sides say no to that one. The Ducks use the high pick on McTavish, and the Leafs like Nyes, and they've got to sign him still. He's a restricted free agent, but don't see any issue there. I think Matthew Nyes, quite honestly, is going to be in discussion for the U.S. Olympic team next year in Milan. I think he's got a real chance when you look at how many players might come in or be off the rosters that played at the Four Nations. He wasn't really in the mix in a meaningful way this year, but with the season he's had, I think he's certainly on the radar. And I don't see that being a trade that who dreams this stuff up, I guess is my, where I'm arriving here. That one's the first. I've never even thought of those players being traded for each other, and I just don't see it happening.
Fans think of this stuff every damn day. Every damn day. Anyway, Andrew
bless the
wants
fans,
to
but my
bless
goodness.
the fans. God bless y'all. For real. You keep us going. You keep this podcast. You keep the league going. But sometimes, anyway. Andrew wants to know, do you think the Montreal Canadiens want to trade for more picks and prospects, or do you think a larger trade for a roster player or two would make more sense?
Well, I think they'd like to probably add more roster players. We've seen them do this already a few times, since Ken Hughes has been the GM, whether it was Kirby Dach or Newhook. The reality is, though, the sort of trades, generally speaking, that get made at the deadline are more futures based for current help. And so, if you're Montreal, I think you got to be open-minded to both. The Canadiens do have a few players on expiring deals, Jake Evans, Savard, Joel Armia. And so, I think that they're likely to move, frankly, all those players before the deadline period. And so I don't know that those guys are getting you back anything too current. But, the truth is Montreal is trying to be good in the shortest term possible. And so having picks and prospects for those guys doesn't mean you can't turn those picks and prospects into players, say, in the offseason. So, I don't think Montreal is pigeonholed into one way of thinking or one approach to the deadline. But I do expect them to be selling a few players between now and March 7th. And then they're hoping this is the last deadline we can say that about them for, because they've done it at a few in a row now. But obviously, the time is now in Montreal to compete and truly be a playoff team. Starting next season, that'll 100% be the expectation.
From Soap Dispenser, does the revenue to the NHL during the Four Nations count as hockey-related revenue with respect to the overall salary cap?
No, it's outside of that. I mean, it's still probably too soon to say, well, I don't know if they made money or how much they made or all those sorts of things. But it's basically a side agreement between the players and the league. Obviously, that was a co-sanctioned event. You saw Marty Walsh, NHLPA executive director, on the ice with Gary Bettman, the NHL commissioner, presenting the trophy. And so all revenues are split between players broadly and owners. But it's not part of the cap calculation per se. And really the cap calculation will be monitored on an ongoing basis, but the league and the players have made an agreement what next year's cap is. I don't have those numbers right in front of me right now, but as we know, it's going to be jumping up over 100 million in a couple seasons. And so, obviously the sides will revisit where things are at to see if to confirm those numbers as we go along. But, the idea with the Four Nations tournament is any money that was made would be put back into player and owners' pockets, and it would be outside of the typical money earned during the year.
Last one for you. Adam Wild dropped the question in the chat. He actually dropped a tweet in the chat. I'm kind of going into it a little blind here. Yo, CJ, would you ever do this? Front Office Sports is reporting that Adrian Wojnarowski is auctioning off iPhones he's used to break Woj bombs, his NBA and ESPN credentials, and more. Proceeds from the Woj collection will raise NIL money for St. Bonaventure men's basketball. He's the GM of that program. But yeah, it looks like he's selling off. There's a credential from when he was at the 2023 NBA draft when Victor Wembanyama was drafted first overall. An iPhone used to break the NBA suspending their season due to COVID. iPhone used to break the Paul George Kawhi trade to the Los Angeles Clippers. Starting from at least $200 on up. So Adam wants to know if you would do this.
If I could generate any meaningful amount of money for a good cause, I would. But I, alas, do not believe that there's much demand out there for items like that of mine. But I will say I have an insane, stupid amount of credentials and things like that from all the events over the years. So maybe one day, if there's ever a market, why not? I mean, you start collecting that stuff when you're young because you're like, this is so cool. And then eventually you're like, oh my God, I got so many of these things. Like, what's the point of them? But, you know, I don't know. I mean, I'm using Google Pixel too. So I don't have an iPhone.
Fair, but like, I mean, maybe look, hey, I'm sure someone somewhere would be willing to pay some kind of money for like your 2010.
They might send me $250, which will cover the shipping to wherever they live.
Jeez. I think you're selling yourself a little bit short, Siege.
But to answer the spirit of Adam's question, yes, I would do that. I just am skeptical that there would be any point to doing that at this point in time.
All right, we'll add something to the SDPN website, a little shop corner for all of the items you eventually do want to sell.
When I was leaving the Four Nations face-off the night after, like way late after the Thursday game, someone there said, "Hey, do you want one of these name tags?" They had big name tags, like they were big that went on each player's pod whenever they were meeting the media or whenever they were at the podium, and I was like, "No, like
you didn't want one?
It's kind of, where do you put this stuff, man?"
Like a book. I got a bookshelf with a bunch of stuff. I would have done that.
So I could have grabbed one. I don't know which were still left. Like, I'm not, like, I don't know, maybe if other people like given away the McDavid's or whatever have you, but I don't really collect things is what I'm getting at. If you've ever moved a couple times as an adult, you like, what do you need all this stuff for? I got the memories. That's what matters most.
I don't know. As someone who's moved a couple of times in my adult life, I need them. I need the memories, but sometimes it's good to have some physical stuff too.
I guess I should have brought that and taken it into the SDPN studio. They probably could have housed it there if I had like the Sidney Crosby nameplate or whatever. But anyway,
that's
alas,
sick. That's sick. I would showcase the crap out of that. Anyway, thank you, Adam Wild, and everyone else for their questions for today's Ask CJ. We'll be back later this week with stick taps and more to come on any trade talk and more news surrounding the National Hockey League. CJ, great work as always. You can always check out his work, if not on this pod, at The Athletic, where he does amazing work over there. And keep it locked here for more great content.
The Chris Johnston Show. Follow Chris on Twitter at @ReporterChris and follow Julian at JKA McKenzie.
The Chris Johnston Show.